Between 1945 and 1954, France waged a remote war more than 9,000 kilometers from Paris. It was an horrific war, marked by bargaining and betrayal, idealism and disillusionment. It was a war of liberation and servitude, of hope and hell. This war devastated a country, caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, and initiated the collapse of the French colonial empire. It was a war with many facets: a colonial war, a war of independence, a Cold War, and a long-forgotten war. In the 1930s, France controlled an immense empire of nearly 40 territories, spanning Asia, Africa, America, and Oceania. It ruled over nearly 100 million people, covering 12 million kilometers. French Indochina, made up of Laos, Cambodia, and the three parts of Vietnam, Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin China, was regarded as the crown jewel of the empire. France had been flying its flag there for 70 years. In the streets of Saigon, Hanoi, and Hue, the same scenes were played out over and over again.
Saigon, dans un grand soleil d'or, c'est le plus joli port, dans le plus beau décor. Saigon.
Most of the colonists lived well in these cities, which combined European living standards with exotic charms. Businessmen negotiated lucrative deals on cafe terraces, while their wives busied themselves in a world designed for their gratification. A paradise considered by many to be a model colony. But while the bulk of the 36,000 colonists enjoyed the gentle tropics, daily life for the vast majority of the 23 million Indochinese under French rule was much bleaker. Vaccination campaigns reduced mortality rates, and the middle class benefited from the French presence, but many Vietnamese still worked in mines, fields, and factories. Decades after the abolition of slavery, brutal forms of exploitation were still present. The colonizers exploited the country's immense natural resources: ore, wood, coal, tea, rice, and above all, rubber trees, which brought in huge profits. These resources generated the fortunes of major industrial groups like Rivaux-Hallé and Michelin. As the popular song goes, the rubber leaf is a magnificent green. Each tree is nourished by the corpses of the workers. In this society, where the colonists and the indigenous people rarely saw one another, other than in the huge brothels in Saigon's Cholon district, independence movements were already making noise. They were all violently suppressed by the colonial authorities. Woe to anyone who dared to raise their voice. But an incident was about to disrupt this situation. In June 1940, France was completely annihilated by Nazi Germany in less than 6 weeks. The empire was stunned. Govan Shu, a young man from Vietnam, recalled,
"Back home we used to say, what fools the Germans are attacking such a great empire. The defeat of 1940 was so unexpected that some people refused to believe it. There was something distorted in our ideas.
While the Germans paraded through Paris, their Japanese allies entered Indochina.
Japan moves in to protect Indochina. Weak French administrators supinely accept Japanese occupation and the fiction of Japanese protection. Imagine the feelings of French officers betrayed by the government at Vichy and forced to facilitate the plans of those who are working against France and her former ally.
The Japanese army moved into the area. They recognized the sovereignty of Vichy France over the region, but they plundered the country and established control over it. For the Indochinese, it was a double blow. They were being exploited by their former rulers as well as their new ones. Shackles that the Vietnamese nationalists could not accept. An outspoken activist, Nguyen Ai Quoc, was at the forefront of the struggle. The man was an experienced revolutionary. Born in 1890, a member of the Socialist Party and then the French Communist Party, he cut his teeth in Paris, Moscow, and Beijing before founding the Vietnamese Communist Party. This committed communist changed his name 100 times to evade the authorities. He was nevertheless registered by the French security services.
Nguyen Ai Quoc, known as Nguyen Tat Tan. Nguyen Van Tan, known as Nguyen Sinh Kung, or Nguyen Bicon, known as Li Tui. Often changes his name, carefully conceals his true origin, forges his accent.
The pseudonyms he adopted reflected his ambition. First, he christened himself Nguyen Ai Quoc, Nguyen the Patriot. Then in 1941, he took the name he would bear for the rest of his life, Ho Chi Minh, Ho of enlightened will. That same year, he founded the League for the Independence of Vietnam, better known as Viet Minh. At the age of 50, Ho Chi Minh was looking for the right opportunity to gain independence for his country. It didn't take long for the opportunity to present itself. In March 1945, Germany and Japan knew they were going to lose the war. After occupying Indochina for 5 years, the Japanese wanted to expel the French from the Asian continent. They attacked the colonists. The majority of French soldiers were interned in camps. Those who dared to resist were tortured, shot, or beheaded. In Lang Son, in northern Vietnam, the mass graves of hundreds of civilians and soldiers killed by the Japanese were discovered. To put an end to French sovereignty, Tokyo granted independence to the 3 Indochinese states. In Cambodia, the young king Norodom Sihanouk declared independence. King Sisavang Vong took over in Laos. And Emperor Bao Dai, forever sporting his sunglasses, declared independence in Vietnam. But while these rulers may have won their thrones, they didn't have any power. The Japanese remained the rulers. French Indochina ceased to exist. In May 1945, after 5 years of bloodshed and tears, the Third Reich laid down its arms. The war in Europe was finally over. The war is over was the message in every country where victory was being celebrated. But in the Pacific, the Second World War continued. The Japanese were putting up fierce resistance. To win, the Americans needed intelligence on the Japanese troops occupying Indochina. As Ho Chi Minh was opportunistic, he approached the Americans. He was looking for legitimacy. He placed his few men at the service of agents from the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, which operated in the Far East. They provided invaluable information on the occupying forces. In return, the United States trained around 200 Viet Minh militants. Grenade throwing, rifle marksmanship, operating a rocket launcher. When the time came, they would be able to rise up against the Japanese invaders. Major Archimedes Paty, in charge of the OSS in Indochina, confessed,
Although they were Marxist, the real aim of these Viet Minh guerrillas was to fight the Japs, and that was the primary objective of our plan.
A few photos captured this unusual collaboration. Ho Chi Minh can be seen among the American officers. These smiling men are unaware that 20 years later, they would clash in the Vietnam War. A few months later, in August 1945, the atomic bombs rained down on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Like Germany, Japan capitulated. For Ho Chi Minh, it was the perfect opportunity. The Japanese troops were leaving the country, and the French troops had not yet returned. The road was clear. Ho Chi Minh called on his supporters to take over the official buildings. On September 2nd, 1945, he entered Hanoi's Ba Dinh Square and gave a speech that would go down in history.
Vì những cái tên chúng tôi chính phủ lâm thời của nước Việt Nam Dân Chủ Cộng hòa rình ròng tuyên bố với thế giới rằng nước Việt Nam có quyền hưởng tự do và độc lập và sự thật là thành nước tự do.
When Ho Chi Minh raised the flag of independence, he won the hearts of the Vietnamese people, who called him Uncle Ho. The popular momentum was immense. The battle was not yet won, but the fight was on. A schoolboy remembered.
After 60 years of carrying the dishonor of being under foreign domination, we had our president and a declaration of independence like every other free country in the world.
A young Vietnamese man wrote in his diary,
Today we're free. Free to laugh, to sing, to live independently. Free to cry and suffer for the country of our fathers.
In mainland France, this coup de force was unacceptable. For de Gaulle, then president of the provisional government, Paris did not have to obey the dictates of this rebel. France had to re-establish its reputation, with blood and steel if necessary.
La France fixe comme l'un des buts principaux de son activité dans sa puissance renaissante et dans sa grandeur retrouvée, le développement de l'Union indochinoise. C'est pourquoi, dans l'Union indochinoise, elle est et elle restera sa propre mandataire.
Restoring the empire was a priority. De Gaulle sent General Leclerc, a hero of the Second World War, to Indochina immediately. The country had to be taken back from the Viet Minh. Leclerc's 45,000 men quickly began the reconquest. But de Gaulle didn't think about any diplomatic solutions. It was up to the guns to provide the answers. Ho Chi Minh could not afford a war. He was pragmatic, negotiating with the French and allowing their troops to return to Vietnam. Leclerc had conquered Kufra, Paris, and Strasbourg. Now he had added Saigon and Hanoi to his list of victories. The French colonists could breathe a sigh of relief. 3 months earlier, they had been massacred by the Japanese and feared for their future. They were relieved and welcomed their liberators with jubilation. It reminds us of Paris, said the veterans of the 2nd Armored Division. Colonial order was restored. But this recapture did not bring peace. To halt the gunfire, negotiations in France had to begin. A few months later, on May 31st, 1946, Ho Chi Minh flew back to France. The timing was bad. The Fourth Republic was in the middle of a political crisis. De Gaulle had left office a few months earlier, and Félix Gouin's government had just fallen. But no matter, the Viet Minh leader was urged to be patient and to explore the riches of the Basque region. He visited Biarritz and Saint-Jean-de-Luz and learned to play pelota until a government was finally formed. After 3 weeks of forced tourism, Ho Chi Minh finally arrived at Le Bourget, full of hope, to the cheers of a delegation of compatriots. He addressed his hosts in French.
Frères français, laissez-moi vous dire que Français et Vietnamiens, nous avons le même idéal, liberté, égalité et fraternité. Nous poursuivons le même but, la démocratie et la paix. C'est pourquoi je suis sûr que Français et Vietnamiens, nous y arriverons à l'entente et à la collaboration égale, loyale et fraternelle.
2 weeks later, negotiations opened in Fontainebleau on July 6, 1946. Georges Bidault, the new prime minister, welcomed the Vietnamese leader. But things got off to a bad start. Ho Chi Minh had barely left Saigon when the High Commissioner in Indochina, Thierry d'Argentlieu, proclaimed the creation of an autonomous republic in Cochin China, a prosperous region in southern Vietnam, where most of the colonists and their businesses were concentrated. D'Argentlieu acted without consulting Paris. The move constituted a betrayal, as Ho Chi Minh had laid claim to the entirety of Vietnam. It was a serious blow to the negotiations. The conference ended in failure. A Vietnamese negotiator acknowledged,
"We agreed on just one thing, and that was that we agreed on nothing."
However, Ho Chi Minh did not return with nothing. The negotiations had given him an international stature that enhanced his prestige. He announced,
"If we have to fight, we'll fight. You'll kill 10 of us, and we'll kill just one of you, and in the end, you'll be the one who gets tired of it.
The unthinkable quickly happened. On November 23, 1946, after clashes following the seizure of a Viet Minh junk carrying weapons, the French Navy bombed the port of Haiphong. The young Phan Tam Tan remembered.
I was 14. Haiphong was known as the City of Red Blazes. In May, the trees bloomed. But it was November. The red color came not from the flowers, but from the fires.
The death toll, between 300 and 6,000, depending on the sources. Ho Chi Minh decided to fight back. A month later, on December 19, 1946, he called on the Vietnamese people to rise up.
He who has a gun, let him use his gun. He who has a sword, let him use his sword. Let everyone fight colonialism.
In the north, Hanoi went up in flames. French nationals were massacred and buildings ransacked. A chain of escalating violence was set in motion. The French army shelled Hanoi day and night. In February 1947, French troops finally regained control of the Indochinese capital. Ho Chi Minh and his men had gone underground in the north of the country, in Tonkin. This was just the beginning of the Indochina War. The French people remained indifferent to the drama unfolding so far from their borders. 2 years after the end of the liberation, many towns remain in ruins. The citizens of France were still trying to keep warm, feed themselves, and find shelter. The difficulty of daily life eclipsed any opposition to the war. Only a handful of intellectuals and pacifist activists spoke out. As Jean-Paul Sartre wrote in his journal, Les Temps Modernes,
it's unimaginable that after 4 years of occupation, the French don't recognize the face that is now theirs in Indochina. Don't they see that it's the face of the Germans in France?
A declaration which, at the time, resembled a lone cry in the wilderness. Especially as there was no clear head of state. Since de Gaulle's resignation, there had been 5 successive governments. 5 governments within 2 years. These repeated crises prevented any meaningful decisions from being taken. General Leclerc warned,
You need 500,000 men to win. Otherwise, we might as well settle the matter now, grant independence, and save ourselves a war we can't win.
Leclerc was not listened to. In 1947, Paul Ramadier's government finally decided on a strategy. It announced,
We will end the war as soon as there is order and security.
It was a way of buying time because no government wanted to give up Indochina. It was essential to the greatness of the empire. It was time for a confrontation. The Far East Expeditionary Force numbered 100,000 soldiers. They enlisted because they wanted adventure, to defend the flag, or to earn a few stripes. Ho Chi Minh had only 60,000 motivated but poorly equipped men. As a result, in less than a month, the French regained partial control of the territory. A soldier wrote to his brother,
My old friend, incredibly, the enemy has almost vanished into thin air. It's a perfect military expedition.
Ho Chi Minh, like all the Viet Minh leaders, eluded the French. His fighters refined their strategies. At their head was a former history teacher, General Giap. This Napoleon enthusiast had a tenacious hatred of the colonizers, and with good reason. His first wife had died in French prison, and his sister-in-law was executed for her communist activism. These wounds continued to sting. Since the Battle of Hanoi, Giap understood that his men had no chance of defeating the French army in regular confrontations. Their only advantage was guerrilla warfare. They would exploit their knowledge of the terrain to force their opponents into a war of attrition. Ho Chi Minh compared his army to a tiger facing an elephant.
If the tiger doesn't move, the elephant will pierce it with its powerful tusks. But the tiger is always on the move, striking fast and hard before disappearing.
From then on, the Viet Minh would attack, escape, and withdraw into impenetrable areas. The enemy was invisible. The French army had to flush them out. The military stroll of the earlier days was transformed into a living hell. Every path, every jungle, every rice field became a trap for an ambush. A corporal confided,
These hidden traps that pierce the foot have become our worst fear. Every time it's a wound that gets infected, a blow to morale, and then 2 or 3 of us are called upon to transport the injured person.
This war without a battlefront was unsettling the officers. One captain confessed,
Here we're finding it hard to control this unpredictable opponent. It's not much like what we were taught at Saint-Cyr. As for our material superiority, it doesn't help us much in this terrain, where tanks and lorries get bogged down.
The stalemate was just beginning.
Pictures received from Indochina certainly underline the difficulties in which France is involved in the Far East. As always in such conflicts, the resulting hardship for many people in the country is very great. French difficulties, too, are very real. Interrogations play a big part in the struggle. It's hard to know who is friend and who is foe. Here, for example, is an 8-year-old boy, innocent enough perhaps, yet he'd been used by the Vietnam as a spy.
Badgered and isolated in the midst of a population they distrusted, the French soldiers sometimes gave in to violence or became embroiled in bloodthirsty acts of revenge. Sergeant Jean-Claude Messeman wrote to his future wife,
The first village we came across was sacked and gutted. We didn't want them to start, so we burnt down the village.
On November 29, 1947, the French army entered the village of Cao Ho in South Vietnam. 286 inhabitants were massacred. Far from winning over the people, the expeditionary force alienated them. Win Kong Hon, then a young teenager, was hit by a French bullet. He described his experience.
I don't know what I was thinking about except killing the French. I was obsessed with that. But everyone was thinking about that. That's what we'd do when we grew up. Kill the French.
The acts of reprisal by the colonial army and the brutalization of Vietnamese society drove thousands of recruits into the arms of Ho Chi Minh.
Les rencontrer simplement, évidemment, évidemment. Elle n'était pas belle, 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 elle devenait légèrement. Elle n'avait qu'une chose pour elle, quelque chose de très étonnant. Elle était swing, 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 oh terriblement swing, swing.
Far from the jungle and the countryside, in the streets of Saigon and Hanoi, the French community still held on to the belief that better days lay ahead. Life there was peaceful. Young soldiers and colonists enjoyed the cafes, bars, and dance halls. On Radio France Asia, the very young presenter Jacques Chancel played songs requested by soldiers.
Cheveux au vent, main dans les poches et le cœur content, je vais de l'avant.
Years later, the famous journalist would say,
Nobody, except perhaps a few soldiers who took advantage of leave to drink their pay in the bars of Cholon, seemed to appreciate the extent of the war raging in the bush.
The soldiers on leave were attempting to escape the miserable times. They gambled at the casino, experimented with opium, and socialized with the women. Sometimes these women were part of Ho Chi Minh's love brigades, providing valuable intelligence. The war was atrocious, but it made a lot of people rich. Prostitutes, gun runners, merchants, shopkeepers, they were all involved in trafficking, not least with the Viet Minh. Opium, weapons, everything could be bought and sold. They bought Indochinese piastres for 10 francs and sold them in France at the official rate of 17 francs, pocketing the difference on the way. War had its benefits. A Frenchman in the import-export business confided,
How many more good years do you think there'll be in Indochina? Let's hope the war lasts.
Despite some attacks by the Viet Minh, the authorities were reassuring, as the Minister for War declared in 1947.
I believe that there's no longer a military problem in Indochina. The success of our weapons is total.
Terrible blindness.
In Bombay, the farewell to Britain's last troops to leave. The departure of the Somersets from Bombay, together with the farewell already said by the Black Watch at Karachi, meant that the British Army had now left both dominions. Great friendliness had marked the final leave-taking, and strict ceremony was the order of the day. For our men, it must have been a moment of mixed feelings. For Indians, a new era had begun.
Throughout the world, colonial empires were crumbling. The British Crown had already given up India, Ceylon, and Burma. The Netherlands was beginning to let go of Indonesia. French leaders were not blind. They recognized that sooner or later they would have to make concessions, but France clung to its empire. In 1947, it crushed a bloody revolt in Madagascar and was striving to hold on to its African colonies. The deadline had to be postponed for as long as possible. Between investments by French companies, raw materials, and the desire to maintain its stature, there seemed to be too much at stake to abandon the crown jewel of the empire. To prevent the loss of its territory and crush communism, Paris devised a political strategy. It had to deprive Ho Chi Minh of popular support by relying on a nationalist figure recognized by all Vietnamese. The lucky man was none other than Bao Dai, the ex-emperor with sunglasses who had been supported by the Japanese in 1945.
L'ex-empereur d'Annam Bao Dai arrive en baie d'Along, où il a été reçu officiellement par M. Bollaert, haut commissaire de France en Indochine, L'importance des conversations qui se sont déroulées au cours de cette rencontre est considérable. Les observateurs s'accordent à reconnaître que l'entrevue de la baie d'Along peut marquer un tournant de la politique indochinoise.
The French had confidence in this sophisticated bourgeois, who had also been brought up in France. But his lordship preferred a life of leisure with occasional buffalo hunting rather than take on the role of head of state. His nickname, the Emperor of Casinos. Paris urged him to lead an independent Vietnam that would remain in the bosom of France, but he hesitated. Paris lost precious time, and controlling the population had become a crucial issue. While the French were banking on Bao Dai, Ho Chi Minh was banking on the masses. In 1948, the Viet Minh launched their first major patriotic campaign, a well-established propaganda tool in the communist world. The goal? To strengthen their hold on the peasantry. The party organized competitions to identify the villages that donated the most rice, clothing, or meat to Viet Minh fighters in order to obtain a certificate of patriotism. Viet Minh political commissars traveled the countryside, encouraging crowds to spread the word. The Viet Minh soon boosted its ranks to 400,000 men. Membership was often seen as an honor. The young Phan Tan Tam wrote,
"This is one of the happiest days of my life. I'm no longer alone. I now belong to the 2,000-strong E-34 regiment, whose motto is, 'We are certain of our victory.'"
The indoctrination worked all the better as opponents were murdered in cold blood. Beneath his seemingly unassuming appearance, Ho Chi Minh was a true warlord. Nothing diverted him from his two objectives, independence and the establishment of a communist regime. While the French were committing atrocities, the communists were waging a bloody crackdown on rival nationalist movements. The influx of volunteers gave communist leaders the opportunity to switch from guerrilla warfare to more ambitious operations. On March 1st, 1948, they attacked a convoy escorted by 150 soldiers on the Saigon-Dalat Road. The toll was dramatic. Almost 100 dead and over 200 hostages. A disaster. Despite the press coverage of the event, the French public were still largely indifferent. The reason? Only professionals and volunteers were fighting in Indochina, and many of the troops were recruited from within the French Empire. Algerians, Moroccans, and soldiers from sub-Saharan Africa. Colonized people fighting other colonized people. As a result, the vast majority of the population overlooked the drama unfolding in this far-flung battleground. A soldier told his story.
"It's an ignored war. It hurts my heart when I think of the heroism of many of my comrades, my lieutenants killed."
Yet, criticism about the war was starting to emerge. At the time, the Communist Party was one of France's strongest parties. It denounced the foul war, which, it said, served the interests of finance and big business. Its slogan, "Not one man, not one penny for the Vietnam War." This was during the Cold War, and Moscow's influence was felt far and wide. In the ports, dockers went on strike to prevent arms being shipped to Indochina. To stir up public opinion, communist militants secretly filmed what no one wanted to see: the dozens of coffins of French soldiers being unloaded every day in the greatest secrecy. The French leaders became increasingly worried. Confidence had to be restored at all costs. At the end of 1949, after 3 years of war, France had failed to crush the Viet Minh, despite the superiority of its army. In the absence of a military solution, the authorities finally granted independence to Vietnam and placed Emperor Bao Dai at its head, who had finally agreed to assume the position.
La France a été le pays de ma jeunesse. Je la savais trop soucieuse de liberté et de justice pour ne pas souhaiter avec moi une solution pacifique du conflit. J'ai donc accepté l'appel du peuple vietnamien.
But the independence was entirely symbolic. Paris retained control of defense, currency, diplomacy, and trade. The French authorities felt this gesture would calm things down. Minister of War Costefleuret declared,
"We're finally out of the tunnel."
But it was too late. The Viet Minh had consolidated its hold on the country, above all in the north. Giap and Ho Chi Minh developed their armies. Companies became battalions. Battalions, regiments. For the previous 3 years, France had always been a step behind. By refusing to give up anything, France would end up losing everything. And another event would further shift the balance of power. On October 1st, 1949, the Communists seized power in China. Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic. From then on, the Viet Minh could count on the help of their big red brother to win the war. For Ho Chi Minh, this was an immense relief. Communist China supplied weapons and dispatched experts. It also offered General Giap a sanctuary where he could train his troops far from French guns. The repercussions were enormous. In the era of the Cold War, the United States became alarmed at the red wave sweeping across Asia. After conquering China, communism turned to the land of the morning calm. In June 1950, North Korea's Red troops attacked South Korea. American President Harry Truman, returning for a second term, set himself a goal: to contain the expansion of Soviet influence in the world.
We are united in detesting communist slavery. We know that the cost of freedom is high, but we are determined to preserve our freedom no matter what the cost.
Like Roosevelt before him, the American president had always opposed colonialism. But due to the involvement of Communist China, he reconsidered his position. The nature of the Indochina War had changed. From a colonial war, it became a hot front in the Cold War, pitting the communist camp against the free world. Truman pledged to support France. Mao's victory came as a shock to the French. Their strategists decided to abandon several fortified points in northern Indochina along the Chinese border. These garrisons on Colonial Route 4 were too exposed to enemy threats and proved difficult to resupply. On October 3rd, 1950, just as the evacuation of the Cao Bang outpost had begun, General Giap launched a full-scale attack with more than 30,000 men. Trapped on a narrow road, the French forces suffered a terrible assault. Even the reinforcements were caught off guard. A soldier reflected.
There was shooting from above, to the left and to the right. Men were dropping like flies. I must have left dozens of wounded behind, calling out for their mothers in every language.
Viet Minh soldiers captured thousands of prisoners. French leaders fell into a state of panic. Bases were abandoned even though they were in no way threatened. Tons of equipment was surrendered to the enemy without a fight. It was a horrendous blunder. The Viet Minh gained control of the northern border. Nothing could stop the flow of Chinese weapons and equipment. In 2 weeks, the French army had lost almost 5,000 of its best fighters. The troops were disgusted. A dejected young soldier, Bernard de Lattre de Tassigny, wrote to his father,
Without wanting or being able to criticize, I think we're being bossed around by arseholes.
The French news continued to report that the situation was under control.
Les mesures militaires prises à la suite du désastre de Cao Bang sont en cours et l'offensive communiste semble stoppée. Mais il appartient au gouvernement de préciser définitivement dans les jours qui viennent la politique qu'adoptera la France dans le douloureux drame indochinois.
The disaster at Cao Bang shook up public opinion. In 1950, the French finally understood that their soldiers were fighting on the other side of the world and dying by the thousands. The French Communist Party increased its demonstrations.
Allez dire, chers camarades, à mon peuple, que le Parti communiste de France ne faillira pas à son devoir à la lutte pour soutenir vos justes revendications de liberté et d'indépendance.
The Marseille docker strike, which began in November 1949, soon spread to the railroads. The movement saw its first martyrs, like Raymond Dien, a 20-year-old typist who was imprisoned for lying down in front of a train carrying military equipment to the Far East. But above all else, it was the case of Henri Martin that mobilized public opinion. A volunteer in the French Navy, he was a communist activist who had witnessed the bombing of the port of Haiphong. He was arrested in March 1950 and sentenced to 5 years in prison for distributing leaflets and newspapers in Toulon Harbor. 5 years for daring to protest. In Paris and the provinces, defense committees were formed on the initiative of the Communist Party. Raymond Dien and Henri Martin, both convicted, became emblems of the cause. They symbolized the struggle of the French people against the bloody war in Indochina. From Jean Cocteau to Jean-Paul Sartre, the political, intellectual, and artistic world mobilized. Fernand Léger and Pablo Picasso each immortalized the features of the young sailor. The Communist Party brought the protest to the National Assembly. In the autumn of 1950, the radical deputy Pierre Mendès France advocated negotiations. In an emotional moment, he announced,
We simply don't have the means to implement the military victory we've been hoping for so long. Have the courage to face the truth. Have the courage to tell the country.
His visionary speech caused a sensation, but won little support. For René Pleven, the 11th French Prime Minister since the start of the war, the very idea of a compromise with the Viet Minh was unthinkable. Negotiations would mean a victory of communism, which would therefore be a betrayal by France of its allies fighting the Reds in Korea. The shock of Cao Bang should have opened the eyes of France's leaders, but the Cold War blinded them. They decided to continue fighting. To restore the leader's reputation and the morale of the troops, Paris desperately needed to find new inspiration.